Picture this. It's June 24th, 1314. A Scottish king stands on a muddy battlefield, watching 20,000 English knights thunder toward his ragtag army of just 6,000 farmers, blacksmiths, and shepherds. The ground shakes beneath their feet. Steel glints in the morning sun. Every military expert would tell you this is suicide. The English have the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, battle-hardened knights, and overwhelming numbers. But in the next few hours, something extraordinary will happen. Something so shocking that it will echo through the halls of history for 700 years. The mighty English war machine will be utterly destroyed. Their king will flee in disgrace. And a new nation will be born from the mud and blood of Bannockburn. How did 6,000 Scots achieve the impossible? How did they turn certain death into glorious victory? The answer will surprise you. Welcome back to History in Motion. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the most incredible military upsets in human history. The Battle of Bannockburn wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a collision of two worlds, two ways of thinking, and two very different ideas about what makes an army truly powerful. To understand why this battle matters, we need to go back to the beginning, to a kingdom in chaos and a people pushed to the very edge of extinction. Scotland, in 1286, was a prosperous kingdom under King Alexander III. But tragedy struck when Alexander died in a freak riding accident, leaving only his young granddaughter Margaret as heir. When she too died in 1290, Scotland faced its worst nightmare: no clear successor to the throne. Into this chaos stepped Edward I of England. Known as the Hammer of the Scots, Edward saw opportunity where others saw crisis. He manipulated the succession, installing John Balliol as a puppet king. But the Scottish people weren't about to become English subjects without a fight. William Wallace rose first, winning a stunning victory at Stirling Bridge in 1297. But Wallace's luck ran out at Falkirk, and in 1305, Edward had him brutally executed in London. The message was clear: resist England, and this is your fate. But sometimes, the darkest hour comes just before the dawn. Enter Robert the Bruce. Robert the Bruce wasn't your typical freedom fighter. He was a nobleman with a claim to the Scottish throne, but also a man who had switched sides more than once in the wars against England. Some called him an opportunist. Others called him a survivor. But in 1306, Bruce made a decision that would change everything. He murdered his rival John Comyn in a church, seized the Scottish crown, and declared war on Edward I. It was a desperate gamble that seemed doomed to fail. Edward immediately excommunicated Bruce and sent armies to crush this upstart king. For years, Bruce fought a guerrilla campaign. His strategy was brilliant in its simplicity: destroy everything the English could use, burn the crops, tear down the castles you can't hold, make Scotland a wasteland that would drain English resources and morale. It was a scorched earth policy that slowly, methodically wore down English control. By 1314, Bruce controlled most of Scotland. Only a few English strongholds remained, including the crucial fortress of Stirling Castle. And that's where our story takes a dramatic turn. Edward Bruce, Robert's brother, had been besieging Stirling Castle for months. The English garrison was starving, desperate, ready to surrender. But medieval warfare had its rules, its codes of honor. The castle's commander made a deal. If English forces didn't relieve the siege by Midsummer's Day 1314, Stirling would surrender. This put King Edward II of England in an impossible position. Edward II wasn't his father. He was weak, indecisive, more interested in his court favorites than warfare. But he couldn't afford to lose Stirling. It would mean losing Scotland forever. So Edward gathered the largest English army in generations. 15,000 men, maybe 20,000. The cream of English nobility rode north. their armor gleaming, their banners flying. They came expecting an easy victory against a handful of Scottish rebels. But Robert the Bruce was ready for them. And he had chosen his battlefield very, very carefully. Here's where Bruce showed his military genius. He didn't wait for the English to find him. He chose exactly where and how this battle would be fought. And his choice was brilliant. Near Stirling Castle flows a small stream called Bannockburn. The ground around it is marshy, broken by woods and rough terrain. For infantry, it was manageable. For heavy cavalry, the backbone of English military power, it was a nightmare. Bruce positioned his army on rising ground, with the boggy stream at their front and forests protecting their flanks. The English would have to attack uphill, across difficult ground, in a narrow front that would negate their numerical advantage. But Bruce had an even more clever trick up his sleeve. He had studied English tactics for years, and he knew their weakness. The English knights were individually superior fighters, but they were also proud, undisciplined, and used to winning through sheer force. Bruce was about to turn their greatest strength into their fatal weakness. The secret to Scottish success lay in a formation called the schiltron. Picture a human hedgehog, hundreds of men packed tightly together, each holding a 12-foot spear pointed outward. When disciplined infantry formed schiltrons, they became virtually impenetrable to cavalry charges. But Bruce took this ancient formation and made it revolutionary. Instead of just standing still and taking charges, Bruce trained his schiltrons to move, to advance, to become offensive weapons that could push back even the finest cavalry in Europe. His men weren't knights. They were farmers, craftsmen, common soldiers. But they had something the English lacked: unity of purpose, iron, discipline, and absolute faith in their king and their cause. The stage was set. The trap was prepared. All Bruce needed now was for the English to walk into it. On the evening of June 23, 1314, the English army arrived at Bannockburn. They were tired from their long march, but confident. Tomorrow they would crush these Scottish rebels and end this war once and for all. But first, there would be blood. Sir Henry de Bohun was young, proud, and eager for glory. When he saw King Robert the Bruce riding alone in front of the Scottish lines, de Bohun saw his chance for immortal fame. He spurred his destrier, lowered his lance, and charged straight at the Scottish king. What happened next became legend. Bruce, mounted on a smaller Highland pony, watched the English knight approach. At the last possible second, Bruce swerved aside. As de Bohun thundered past, Bruce rose in his stirrups and brought his battle-axe down on the knight's helmet with such force that he split both helmet and skull in two. The Scottish army erupted in cheers. The English fell silent. The psychological impact was enormous. Their finest knight, killed in single combat by the enemy king. It was an omen that neither side would forget. The Scottish army erupted in cheers. The English fell silent. The psychological impact was enormous. Their finest knight, killed in single combat by the enemy king. It was an omen that neither side would forget. But the real battle was yet to come. June 24th dawned clear and bright. Edward II deployed his massive army in traditional formation. Heavy cavalry in front, archers behind, infantry bringing up the rear. It looked impressive, intimidating, unstoppable. The English knights formed up in perfect lines, their lances gleaming, their destriers snorting with eagerness. These men had conquered Wales, crushed rebellions in Ireland, and dominated European battlefields for generations. They had never met an enemy they couldn't break. They were about to meet their match. The first charge hit the Scottish schiltrons like a thunderbolt. But instead of breaking, the Scottish formations held firm. English lances shattered against Scottish spears. Knights who had survived a dozen battles found themselves pulled from their horses by determined Scotsmen, the cream of English nobility. died in the Scottish mud. Wave after wave of cavalry threw themselves against the Scottish hedgehogs. Each attack was repulsed with heavy losses. The narrow battlefield meant the English couldn't bring their full numbers to bear. Their own dead and wounded created obstacles for follow-up charges. By evening, the impossible was happening. The English, despite their overwhelming numbers, were losing. Dawn of the second day brought a shock to the English camp. Instead of retreating or standing on the defensive, the Scottish schiltrons were advancing. Bruce had turned his defensive formations into offensive weapons, pushing forward in perfect order, driving the English back step by bloody step. The English found themselves trapped in their own success. They had pushed so far forward that they now had the boggy Bannockburn behind them and rising ground in front. Their famous longbowmen couldn't shoot without hitting their own knights. Their cavalry had no room to maneuver. The panic began to spread through the English ranks. These proud knights, who had never known defeat, suddenly found themselves cornered. Like animals, some tried to flee, only to find the stream behind them clogged with drowning men and panicked horses. And then Bruce played his master. Stroke. As the English army began to waver, a new force appeared on the hills overlooking the battlefield. The English, seeing fresh troops approaching, assumed it was Scottish reinforcements. Their already shaky morale finally cracked completely. But here's the beautiful irony. Those weren't soldiers at all. They were camp followers, servants, cooks, grooms, and baggage handlers who had been watching the battle from a safe distance. When they saw the English beginning to break, they grabbed whatever weapons they could find and charged down the hill, hoping for a share of the plunder. To the terrified English, it looked like a massive Scottish army appearing from nowhere. The psychological impact was devastating. The greatest military force in Europe dissolved into a panicked mob. Knights threw down their weapons and ran. The proud English war machine collapsed in a matter of minutes. Edward II barely escaped with his life, fleeing so quickly that he left behind the royal seal, his shield, and his reputation. The King of England was reduced to begging entry to his own castle at Stirling, only to be refused by his own garrison commander, who was honor-bound to surrender to the Scots. The Battle of Bannockburn was more than just a military victory. It was the birth of a nation. In 2 days of fighting, Robert the Bruce had transformed himself from an excommunicated rebel into the undisputed King of Scots. More importantly, he had proven that Scotland could not only resist English domination, but defeat it utterly. The immediate results were staggering. The Scottish army captured wagons full of gold, silver, and supplies. Dozens of English nobles were taken prisoner, their ransoms filling the Scottish treasury for years to come. Stirling Castle surrendered as promised, giving Bruce control of central Scotland. But the real victory was psychological. For the first time in decades, the Scottish people believed they could win. They had seen English knights, those seemingly invincible warriors, broken and bleeding in Scottish mud. The myth of English military supremacy was shattered forever. Bannockburn didn't just change Scotland, it changed medieval warfare itself. For centuries, heavy cavalry had dominated European battlefields. Knights were the ultimate weapon, combining mobility, armor, and training in an unstoppable package. But Bruce had proven that disciplined infantry, properly led and positioned, could not only stop cavalry, but destroy it. Military commanders across Europe took notice. The age of the mounted knight was beginning to end, and a new era of professional infantry was being born. The battle also transformed European diplomacy. Before Bannockburn, Scotland was seen as a rebellious English province. After Bannockburn, European powers began treating Scotland as an independent kingdom worthy of respect and alliance. This recognition would lead to the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, one of history's most powerful statements of national independence. It declared that the Scottish people would fight for freedom, as long as 100 of us remain alive. Words that would inspire freedom. Fighters for centuries to come. So what can we learn from this extraordinary story? How did 6,000 Scots achieve what seemed impossible? First, leadership matters. Robert the Bruce wasn't just a king. He was a strategic genius who understood both his enemy's strengths and weaknesses. He refused to fight on English terms, instead creating conditions where Scottish advantages could shine. Second, unity of purpose can overcome numerical disadvantage. The Scottish army wasn't just fighting for their king. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their very existence as a free people. That kind of motivation can work miracles. Third, the right tactics in the right place can change history. Bruce's use of terrain, his innovative use of schiltrons, and his psychological warfare all combined to create a perfect storm of military success. But perhaps most importantly, Bannockburn teaches us that no oppressor is invincible. The English seemed unstoppable, their victory inevitable. But courage, intelligence, and determination proved stronger than armor and numbers. Today, 700 years later, Bannockburn remains one of history's greatest military upsets. The battlefield is preserved as a memorial to Scottish independence, visited by thousands who come to stand where ordinary people achieved the extraordinary. The battle's influence extends far beyond Scotland. Military academies still study Bruce's tactics. The story has inspired countless books, films, and songs. Every time an underdog faces seemingly impossible odds, the spirit of Bannockburn lives on. But perhaps the most important legacy is this: Bannockburn proved that no people have to accept domination by another. Freedom isn't something granted by the powerful. It's something seized by the brave. The 6,000 Scots who stood in the mud at Bannockburn weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people who chose to do something extraordinary. They chose to believe that victory was possible, even when every rational calculation said it. And in choosing to believe, they made the impossible happen. That's the power of history, friends. It doesn't just tell us what happened. It shows us what's possible. The courage of those Scottish warriors 700 years ago reminds us that ordinary people can change the world when they refuse to give up. If this story inspired you, if it made you think differently about what's possible when people stand together, then hit that like button and let me know in the comments. What modern situations remind you of Bannockburn? Where do you see underdogs achieving the impossible today? And if you want to discover more incredible stories like this one, tales of courage, strategy, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, then subscribe to History in Motion and ring that notification bell. We're building a community of history lovers who believe the past can inspire the future. Next week, we'll be exploring another military miracle: how Hannibal crossed the Alps with elephants and nearly destroyed Rome. Trust me, you won't want to miss that one. Until then, remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding what humans are capable of when they refuse to accept the impossible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode of History in Motion.